Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. It's fantastic to see so many people here in the audience. This is a sort of community interest and engagement in this sort of topic that you just can't buy. So I think congratulate yourselves really for a moment for being here, for showing up, and for saying, hey, this is important to what we do. And as you'll see me make the case for today, this is also incredibly important for our society as a whole. I will also point out the question, I'll also answer the question that most people have after they've heard my introduction. Yes, I have a lot of student loan debt. So get that out of the way there. So let's talk a bit about the world of early brain and child development and really about the science that underlies so much of this. In 2007, the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child released a report where they tried to pull together all the research we've known for many years and say, what are the big takeaway points that we can use and really use these points to apply not just to policies, but to programs and other things that affect children. And I want to walk you through those. The first thing they did was they came out and said, you need child development as a foundation for community and economic development. Now, we think of kids generally as, they're cute and they're adorable, as you heard earlier, right? And that we should be helping kids because that's an inherent good. But the thing is, they are also future potential economic units, right? They are our citizenry. There are consumers. There are employers. There are employees. They are so much of our society. They are our society. So when we don't invest in the early brain, in the development of children, we're basically saying our society doesn't have a future. The infrastructure of the early brain is as important as the infrastructure of bridges and highways and things like that. We need to think about it as a piece of economic development just as much as anything else. Number two, brains are built over time. We can't put all of our money just in the first year of life and say, yay, we're done, we did it, okay, nothing else, right? Because gains have to be made, but then we need to support those gains later on. You just can't pull everything away. This also means you can't fix everything later on. There's this notion sometimes that, well, we'll fix that when they get to school. As you'll see, we can't just do that. You need to really be taking the long view and thinking about the years that go before formal entry into school, into kindergarten and first grade. And if you want to think about a child's development, there's kind of a three-legged stool you can do. There's the biological factors that we look at all the time in healthcare, and those are important. We recognize, though, that the socioeconomic environment matters, that a child's zip code that they're born and brought up in matters more than their genetic code when it comes to their outcomes. But then we also came to recognize that it wasn't just a socioeconomic environment, that broad environment, but it's also the microenvironment around them. Who's at home? Who's talking to them? Who's in their childcare center? Who's in their neighborhood? And what's the nature of those interactions and what are they like? Those attachment and relationship patterns matter just as much as those other factors. And that brings me to the next point, that you need two things, genes and experience, to wire the brain. It's like a campfire. You need that wood, and you need the flame, and you need the spark to get the flames going. So you can't have one without the other. Now, we can't affect genes so much, I won't have time to get into that today, but you can mold experiences, and we can do that through the advice we give, through the programs we set up, and through the policies that we enact. And if you had to pick out an active ingredient, what is it that makes that brain wire in a good, because all these things are in quotes, because you can argue about what is good and not good, but still, what is it that gets better wiring versus not as good wiring? It's the nature of a child's interaction with caring, consistent adults around them. That back and forth, like in tennis, that serve and return, that back and forth that occurs is what drives development. Not iPads, not DVDs, not gimmicky programs. It is interaction with caring, consistent people that makes the difference to the young brain, and we have tons of evidence showing that. The next point is you need simple things to do more complex things. So when people say to you, if they ask you about this project, why are we putting all this money into kids just going and playing? Well, because as T. Barry Brazelton said, play is the work of infancy. This is that child's job. They need to be doing these things in order to gain more sophisticated skills to be able to develop and do well in school and so on. So we need the simple things in order to do the more complex things. This next point we're going to spend a few moments on, this idea of toxic stress. And I'll define that more carefully in just a second, but toxic stress is associated with persistent effects on the neuroendocrine system and damages the developing brain. Toxic stress happens to young children, okay, when their brains are vulnerable. And it affects them in ways that have lifelong implications for not just their mental health and their learning, but actually for very real markers of their physical health as well. So this CT scan, these are head CTs of 2 3-year-old kids. This is like you're looking at the brain as if there's a cut this way and you're looking up into the brain. The child on the left is a typically developing child. The child on the right is one who underwent extreme emotional neglect, not physical, but emotional neglect. This is a child from an Eastern European warehouse-style orphanage from the 1980s. Without knowing much about how to read a CT scan, you can see that brain is small. It looks shrunken. It doesn't look as neuronally dense. So you can see that environmental influences like that have an effect. And you can see that in extreme circumstances like this without knowing a whole lot about how to read these things. In less extreme circumstances, we can also measure issues, and we'll come to that in a moment. Now, in the stress response, stress is how we respond to the environment around us. Some level of stress is actually normal. You need to have a stress response and a well-developed stress response to learn how to deal with things like changes in light, temperature, hunger, those sorts of things, those minor everyday things that we deal with all the time. You need a stress response. When you have more significant levels of stress, it's okay. You can still tolerate that and manage it. But the stress response is something that you use to deal with changes around you. When you have extreme stressors, okay, like you encounter a bear in the woods, your stress response system goes off because it's trying to help you survive. It's trying to keep you from being killed or maimed or whatever the case may be. That is fantastic when you run into a bear. It's fantastic when you're in mortal danger. It's fantastic if it's short term. But when those issues become long term, when they're always there, and that young brain gets hit with that bear response over and over and over, that brain gets tuned for survival, not for growth, not for learning. It gets tuned for survival. And that is critical. So you can think again about 3 levels of stress response. The positive stressors, right? Small amounts of stress are fine. They're actually good. It's how we learn. Okay? I like to joke that positive stress happens every time I get up to give a talk. And that's a good thing, right? You don't want me forgetting what I'm going to say or whatnot, right? That's a good thing. Tolerable stressors are exactly that. They're tolerable. They're serious, but they're temporary. They last for a little while, but then they go away. And if they're buffered by good, supportive relationships, then they are not going to have a lasting negative impact. But then you have toxic stress. Toxic stress is not just a single bad stressor. What it is the prolonged activation of the stress response systems, and there's few or no of those protective relationships. So in a child's life, when you have situations that are really significantly worse, when those supportive relationships are few and far between because of whatever circumstances they've been born and brought up in, so things like child abuse, parental substance abuse, homelessness, these things have a profound effect on the biology of that young child, and we call them toxic stress because of what they do, because they are so key and they have so many causes that they cause so many different issues to that child. So what happens? You have this stressor, that fight or flight, that bear response becomes chronic. It was never meant to be chronic. And you put out these stress hormones, and it leads to changes in the brain we'll talk about in just a moment. But what ends up happening is that the stress response becomes hyper-responsive. You're always looking for the bear. You're always waiting for that bear to appear, and you're not able to focus on anything else that's long-term. You're not as calm, you can't cope, and that leads to more stress. And this turns into a nasty, vicious cycle that just affects that child's ability to learn early on. So what happens in the brain? 3 areas of the brain I want to look at really quickly, and this is a very brief look. One is the amygdala. This is the worry ward of your brain. This is what says bear, self-preservation, fear, act instinctively, run for it. In kids who have had this early toxic stress, this adversity, you see that the amygdala are actually larger when measured on MRI. This is work that's been done right here at UW by Seth Pollack. Countering the amygdala are 2 areas. There's the prefrontal cortex. This is the check to the amygdala. It's your planning, your delayed gratification, thinking through things. You know, if you don't do this today, it'll pay off down the road. It's how you, when you get 3 or 4 things to do at once, how you decide what happens next. This is what lets a child think through multi-step instructions, et cetera, et cetera. Again, those kids with early adversity, there's less neuronal density in that area, and on functional MRI, you see that part of the brain is less active. And then you have the hippocampus, plays a big role in memory and mood, and you see the hippocampal volumes are actually smaller in these kids. Now, the issue is, of course, that people don't come to my clinic, which is just a few blocks from here at Access Community Health Center, and they don't come in and say, "Doctor, I think the problem is that my son's hippocampal volumes are too small." Yeah, that never happens, you know. Instead, what I hear is this: the school had us come in because my child is impulsive. I'm worried because he can't plan ahead. He's anxious. She can't delay gratification. Her mood's all over the place. Her memory's crummy. This sounds a lot like what we might call ADHD, and often these kids do carry that label. But the thing is, I have patients with classic ADHD, and they do great, actually, with just a small dose of medication, because everyone around them is trying and supporting, and they just can't do it. A little bit of meds actually do help. What about all these other kids I have, though, that it doesn't seem to work so well, and that you're still struggling, and the kid is still struggling, the family and the school, and everyone's still struggling? Well, I start to go back in their history, and I ask not just, what was their birth weight, and, did they stay in the NICU and all that business. Were you ever homeless? Did you have enough to eat at all times? Did your child ever witness violence? And what I hear is yes, yes, and yes. And I start to realize that by the time I'm seeing this child at 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or whatever, that this pileup of stressors, the bears in their life, have built up so much that is what I'm seeing really what we call ADHD, or is what I'm seeing the brain effects of adversity that I just talked about? Now here's the problem. I don't have a magic pill for that. No one does. Yeah, we throw some meds around because we're trying to do something. But we need to think about the prevention. We need to get these things sorted out well before we're trying to chase our tails when this kid is only 7 or 8 or so on. So when kids have good experiences, it hopefully leads to better brain development, and that feeds out into good behavior, and that becomes a positive loop and not a negative loop that happens. So the last point, though, from that report was that if we create the right conditions for early childhood development, it's more effective and less costly than trying to figure it out later on. So what can we do? So let's think about the trajectory of children. You got developmental progress. This graph is kind of conceptually from birth to age 5. You got the kids on that quote-unquote healthy trajectory. You want them to stay on that trajectory and not get beaten down by some occurrence along the way. You got the kids who are high risk, right? This is your X26-week preemie, right? You can put a label on them and say, we know they're high risk and we've labeled them as such and so on and so forth. And then you got the kids that we call at risk. Or as one of my colleagues says, we shouldn't call them at risk, we should call them children under siege, because they're kids like any others, but they and their families are under siege by what the world is throwing at them, and they have way too much to deal with. There's many more of them, and they're not so cleanly labeled. So the thing is, even if you're healthy, adversity pushes down on all these curves. And that adversity pushing down on all these curves, there we go, makes a big difference. It hampers their development. So what we need are good protective interventions that help shield those kids from adversity in that early first 5 years of life, those first 2,000 days that they have. So what are those things? Well, for the healthy kids, it's the things we should be doing: good anticipatory guidance, reading together, preschool, all those sorts of things will keep that curve pushed up there. For the kids who we call at risk, parental responsiveness training. There are many parents who have never learned, because it's not been modeled around them in their communities, to do back and forth play, talking, singing, reading to their child together. We can model that. We can model it, we can point it out and call it for what it is and help parents develop their skills in that. It's about developing the parental skills. Good language stimulation, again from people, not products. Words from the TV doesn't count. And then again, high quality early childhood education. And then, of course, for the highest risk kids, all of the above, plus home visiting, specialized services, and so on and so forth. Because if you think about it, there's some key domains that we can really make a difference in. One, I have so many patients who are fantastically intelligent and brilliant, and they are flunking out of school. Why? Because they have too many emotional and behavioral problems layered on top of these fantastic intellects. Who knows what our society has already lost out on because of all these kids that we will never be able to see how fantastic they are in terms of their thinking. So we need to figure out, how do we keep those things from building up in the first place so that they don't become these barriers? Number two, I don't think this is news to anyone in the room, but it is news to some policymakers. Children live in families. You can't transform the lives of children without transforming the lives of their parents. So we need to think about two-generation approaches. Who am I to tell a parent that they should be reading to their child every night when they look at me and say, I'm not home in the evening because I'm working a second job, and we need that second job to keep paying rent so we're not out on the street. Yes, I want you to have a roof over your head and so on. If you're always working, many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're always working at the bottom of that pyramid, right, the food, the shelter, etc., you're never thinking further up on that pyramid. You're not able to see that as attainable because all your attention and all your resources are taken up with the basic needs that are out there. So we need to transform the lives of parents as well. And we need to realize that what all of us do is really health and well-being, not just those of us who work in healthcare, because 80% of what affects health happens outside the clinical realm. What I do in clinic only affects about 20%. So we need to be thinking more broadly. So numbers to remember that are key. There are 700 new neural connections happening per second in the developing brain. We want those connections to happen well. And we want to take advantage of not just one, but two types of brain plasticity. Don't worry about what these terms really mean. The key here is in this third line. Synaptic plasticity is lifelong. We're all using synaptic plasticity to learn. But cellular plasticity is already declining by age 5. So the policy implication of this is that our ability to remediate goes down later on. It's a lot easier to fix speech delay in a 3-year-old than it is in an 8-year-old. And it's a lot easier to fix it in an 18-month-old than it is in a 3-year-old. The earlier we're doing things, the earlier we're helping kids, providing supports against what's out there, the better they'll do. Number 2, 18 months is when we can measure disparities in vocabulary. This graph that's appearing shows you 3 different socioeconomic strata and the receptive vocabulary, the ability of a child to understand words. And you can see already by 18 months, the richest kids are already pulling away from their less affluent peers. And by 24 months, we see the middle class kids pulling away from those in poverty. We talk a lot about the achievement gap. The achievement gap is not an issue of middle schools not doing their job right. It's not an issue of elementary schools not doing their job right. It's not even an issue of preschool. Preschool is off the right hand of this graph. If we can measure the brain changes in toddlerhood, you know darn well they started in infancy. We will fix the achievement gap when we seriously and substantially invest in the first 1,000 to 2,000 days of life and then support those gains that are made later on. And that is why programs like this are so important. For every dollar we put into early childhood, economists tell us $4 to $9 in returns. In fact, James Heckman, Nobel laureate in economics at the University of Chicago, says the best bang for your buck is in programs that target the early years. It's not zero for, schooling, job training, those sorts of things, but he says the earlier you go down, the better it is. And he's made the economic case for it. And as Frederick Douglass said, long before MRIs and all, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. He knew this, he observed it, and he had that figured out. He understood prevention, he understood early intervention. All right, so now that I've thoroughly depressed you all, what can we do about it? I will give you the solution. Well, maybe not the solution. I'll give you principles of solutions because this isn't like polio or smallpox, right, where there's one thing and we can intervene and there's one answer. Because this is a complicated multi-band problem. So the sorts of things we need to, first of all, think about how we can build capabilities. The parent who doesn't know how to read effectively to their young child, we can teach them that. We can do that through modeling, through explaining what we're doing, etc. We can build a capability for them to be the good parent they want to be. I have never run into a parent that doesn't want the best for their child. They may not know how to do it, and that's where we can help them. We also need to build capacities. The parent may know how to read to their child well, and they can't do it because of that second job, because the first job doesn't pay a living wage, or whatever the case may be. So we need to figure out how do we build that capacity that's needed. We need to do things based in homes and communities. It is really important that this preschool is here, is in neighborhoods where people live and work and so on, and that we're not making people trek across town for something. It is really, really important that we're near and close to the everyday reality that families are in. We want to address the root causes. We want to make sure we're doing things to help the parents and help build the parents' own capabilities as well. We want to have long-term effects, which, as you can see from what I'm saying, I do believe these programs do. We want to try to prevent the issues that I'm talking about. We want to leverage those first 1,000 days of life, and that's the age space that preschools are working in. We want to use evidence where it's available, but not be a slave to the evidence. And finally, we want things we can take to scale. We need to think about how we can help not just the kids that we're able to start with, but how do we take this further later on and build out for the future. Remember the 5 R's of early childhood education as well. This is from the American Academy of Pediatrics School Readiness Technical Report. Kids need routines, they need reading, they need rhyming, which means playing and cuddling. They were looking for an R, it doesn't really work, just go for it, okay? Rewards, because they need praise for everyday successes. And finally, relationships. Those relationships matter. And those relationships, yes, parents, yes, givers, but also early childhood teachers. Consistent teachers matter, and they make a big difference. Because somebody once asked someone, I cannot even remember who this was, and I need to track it down, but they asked this expert in all these sorts of programs, what makes the difference? What makes the biggest difference for children? Tell us about the research, all that. And he said, you know what? Actually, we need at least one person, ideally more, but at least one person who is absolutely crazy about that child. And if that can't be a relative or a family member or whatever, or there's too much stress or pressure, fine. If it can be a teacher, that makes a difference. That makes such a key difference. That child knows they're loved, they know they're appreciated. And that's really what this comes down to ultimately. So why did I start by reading to you from The Dot? Because it's a story of a relationship between a teacher and a child who was angry and upset and told herself, I can't do this. I see too many children in my clinic every day who say, I can't do this, I'm no good at school. And they're receiving those messages, intended or not, sometimes from their parents who say, I struggled in school, why would my child be any different? Well, of course your child can be different, but you need to believe that in the first place. And they need to have the right supports. But The Dot is about that relationship. It's also fundamentally about skill building. Because what did that teacher do? She believed in her. She didn't just tell her, oh, you'll be fine, but she celebrated her accomplishments and let her own natural talents come out. But what did Vashti do towards the end of that story? She turned around and she mentored someone else. And that's the promise of what we can do when we do these things right, that when we say we are going to build these skills in you, these socio-emotional skills, these abilities to work with others, to be around others, maybe now you'll turn around and help someone else. And that's one of the reasons I love that story for this topic so much. I'd like to close with a video. This is from the Ounce of Prevention Fund in Chicago. It kind of summarizes what happens in the first 5 years of life, the problems and the outcomes when we don't get it right, and the human stories that are there. But then let's also see how these stories can change when we get it right for children and families. And I think that's really, really key and very powerful. I'll let that video play. So, I'll close with this quote from the Sutton Trust. While schools can do much to raise achievement among children who initially lag behind their peers, all too often preschool gaps set and train a pattern of ever-increasing inequality during school years and beyond. Any drive to improve social mobility must begin with an effective strategy to nurture the fledgling talent in young children so often lost before it has had a chance to flourish. And I see that too often. I see that fledgling talent lost, so I do all that I can to try to make sure that it is allowed to fly. And I always close with this picture. This is my wife reading to my son. I caught them in this lovely moment years ago of being lost in a book together. It reminds me that children are made readers in the laps of their parents and caregivers and other adults, but it also reminds me of the role that adults have as children's first and best teachers. And whatever we can do to support and invest in that is really important and really critical in so many ways. I think I can take 5 minutes or so for some questions if anyone has them. So thank you very much. Thank you. Questions? Sir?
How does this differ from programs like Head Start or just regular daycare?
Yeah, so the question is, how does this differ from programs like Head Start or regular daycare, et cetera? So the first thing I want to do is have people kind of excise the words daycare from their brains. Because here's why, and I sometimes find myself lapsing into that terminology as well. Daycare is basically this notion that the child has to be somewhere, watched by someone, so that their parents can work or do something else. Not as a source for enrichment, not as a source for early learning, not as a source for really supporting healthy brain development. So this is why early education centers, early learning centers, that terminology really has become more popular because it more accurately describes what we now know and what the science supports. How does this differ from Head Start? Well, Head Start is a federally funded program. I can tell you I have many patients who want to be in Head Start, their families want them to be in Head Start, and are still unable to get in. As for details of the curriculum and so on, I will refer you to the program staff as to precisely how those things change. I work a lot with Head Starts, both here and in other parts of the state, and I do think that they provide wonderful supports. You know, one of the things I do through the Reach Out and Read program that you heard mentioned is we give books out at well child visits, and we watch what the child does with it as a way of assessing the child's development and all. I see very big differences between children who have been read to and have gotten supports and have been in high quality early education settings at age 4 and 5 in terms of how they handle the book and point at things and exclaim, versus a child who has not had those sorts of things. And I can see that in just a couple of minutes just in the clinic setting. But all these things make a big difference in terms of helping support that early development.
When you say they can't get a Head Start, is that because waiting lists?
Yeah, waiting list is not enough. We have an interesting, you know, we decided as a country that everyone, over 100 years ago, we decided that everyone should have access to a public education, right? Remember, first kindergarten in the country, Wisconsin, okay? Watertown. So that's great, but then we realized that learning didn't just start at 5. It started well before that. But what we have is a weird patchwork of public and private programs and optional programs and so on that make it very difficult for everyone to access that education before age 5. We're making some headway with things like 4K and so on, but as I presented, it starts way earlier than that. Other questions? Sir?
Yes. It struck me about the toxic stress and 3 stages of stress. In reversing that, it seems to be more of a community effort in trying to not only with the parent, but all of these situations in which your child's environment is. How is it that the cost of that, where is that coming from?
The cost of reversing the stressors? Yeah, so the issue comes in terms of how we choose to invest the resources our society has. The complications is that when a child has those toxic stressors that happen and their development is not optimal, we don't really bear the burden of that until later. We see it in terms of school remediation. We see it in terms of high school dropping out rates. We see it in terms of the criminal justice system and so on. But there's such a long distance between those two things that we have only now started to try to really make the connections and say, you know, why? No one starts out their life saying, I want to be incarcerated. No one says, I want to live in poverty. No one says, I want to be homeless. Yet so many end up there. And let me just remind folks that a lot don't realize this. Children in the US are the single largest group to live in poverty. It is children. It is not senior citizens. It is not veterans, et cetera. I'm not saying poverty doesn't exist in those groups, but it is children that are the most likely to be poor in our country. And if you look at under 200% of the federal poverty line, which is generally a good marker for who is in need, that is 46, 47% of US children. Okay, that should shock every one of us because we don't see kids begging on State Street. Yet there's over 1,300 homeless school kids in the Madison Metropolitan School District. You know, yeah. So the question is, how do we actually move funds from the punitive, the remediatory, et cetera, to way earlier in life? And that will take a concerted effort of not just programs like this, but also of reforming how we look at public policy. And there's some structural issues with that. At the federal level, actually, the General Accounting Office is not allowed to make projections beyond 10 years. So it's 10 years, you're not even going to look, you can't look at the connection between high school graduation rates and what happens in the first year of life. We're getting there. People are starting to hear this, and they're starting to understand the science behind this. But it's a good question. Ma'am?
In 1973, I graduated diversity in early childhood education. And we can say we're just now starting to see this. I have known these things since then. Educators know this. They have known about early childhood, the importance of 18 months, all of that. We have chosen as a society to ignore that and not put our money there. In '73, it never occurred to me that I would retire before we were ever going to make a difference.
I think you're making a fantastic point that most of this is not news, and it's not new news. What is newer is being able to point at markers like cortisol and the MRIs, and I don't think we should need that to have taken action a long time ago. Personally, I agree with you. However, for whatever reason, being able to wave around graphs with cortisol levels and MRI scans seems to speak to some people more. And if that gets us finally maybe somewhere, great, we'll take it. But I completely agree with you. The other thing I'll also point out is that the head of Ready Nation, which is the business alliance for early childhood on the national level, pointed out about 2 years ago at a conference I was at, that the big three automakers, who are bitter business rivals, all sat down together, shoulder to shoulder in front of Congress and asked for their bailout. Yet, those of us who touch the lives of children and families, including pediatrics, early education, home visiting, social work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we represent more of the economy than the big three automakers, yet we don't know how to get up and stand together and ask for our kids to be bailed out. So.
First of all, I'm thrilled to have you talk about stress and cortisol and those hormones. And I think it probably happens in the womb. And you know, it's interesting because in this country, I think for years, people have talked about stress. And they say, oh, you know, there's under a lot of stress in the professional environment. That was not a bad thing. Often it was just, you know, that's just the nature of the job. I think that what I struggle with is, as the video I think shows, parents have probably grown up with continued to live in that same trajectory where they continue to have more and more stress in their lives and never had that stability. And now they have children. And I think I applaud this effort. And I know that many of those kids go back to that same environment where those parents don't have the resources and have that same physiological or emotional or psychological issue. And, you know, maybe it was whoever said, we can't do anything about them, so let's just start with the kids, because you know, in some ways I agree with that, but how do we reconcile, how do we address that? I mean, is it just take the kids out of the home and, you know, or do we just battle with, you know, we're trying to do something, you know, outside, knowing that most of the time they're with their parents?
So the question is, what about the parents who themselves have grown up with toxic stress and are struggling to make it through everyday life? And I think the answer there is, one, we need a two-generation approach, right? We shouldn't view parents merely as a route to get to their children, nor should we view kids as an impediment to the development of their parents. We should think about what can we do that actually addresses the needs of both groups there. Parents, it's not that the brain is completely set. There is still malleability well into the early 30s, you know, certainly by mid-20s. And actually this fascinating work that's been done by one of my colleagues, Sarah Watamura in Denver, who shows that we know that the infant brain has all this, you know, plasticity and blah, blah, blah. That's not news. We know the adolescent brain is also rewiring in so many ways. The third open window that she's shown through a combination of rat models and human MRI scans is actually in new parents. It actually shows that new parents, mothers and fathers, are actually having greater plasticity and greater rewiring in their brain. So when we do things right in the first year of life, home visiting, early education, et cetera, and doing this sort of intentional skill building, we actually stand a good chance of not just helping the kids, but helping their parents as well. And some of this is doable, because again, parents will tell you, when you ask them, what would you like? They will say, I want a stable job that pays well enough, and I want to be able to do the good parenting tasks that I'd like to do. And maybe they need a little help with this. You know, the majority of parents do not say, you know, I've just given up or I don't care anymore. But some of it is also building trust and not doing these one-off things. An ad on a bus is not going to cut it, you know, and it has to be through trusting relationships there as well. Thank you again. If there's other questions, I will be around for a little bit afterwards, but I know that Kaleem has some things to say. Thank you very much.
So we had to do, there's a lot of people we have to do something special for. I have to tell you, hundreds. But we wanted to do something special for Dipesh. This is an extraordinarily busy man. He's actually one of the first people that I went to talk to when we started doing this. I think, Sue, you made a visit with me with him. His door was open. I went in and I did see all those degrees and I actually did think how broke he might be. So I thought I asked him for advice, not money. But we did something for you. One, we have a little card here.
Thank you.
And then we have some outstanding young people here who are very charismatic. And so we wanted to send you away with a picture of one of our little ones. This is Tutu.
Thank you.
And she's going to be pointing at you for the longest time, telling you how great you are.
Isn't that great? Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.